The first sound you hear in this is not a word. It is a pressure low, distant, like the ocean remembering a shape it once learned to keep. If you close your eyes right now, you can imagine it. A single patient hum that fills the bones before it reaches the ears. That hum is how the story begins. That hum is how the story ends. My name was Clara Hensley. I say was because words have a flattering habit of staying alive long after the person who spoke them has been rearranged into something else. I was a nurse at Haverly State Asylum in Massachusetts. In the winter of 1903, I transferred to the annex they called Ward G. They told us Ward G would be a place of new treatment, of modern improvements, an experiment in progress. They used language like progress and efficiency and transfer so neatly that the words themselves acted like blankets over whatever lay beneath. At first, the change felt ordinary. A new doctor arrived with a polished trunk and a charm that moved like a tool. Dr. Jonathan Marrow introduced himself with a bow and a theory. Sound, he said, could be used as method. Sound could be tuned and directed. Sound, when controlled precisely, could coax the brain away from its worst habits. He used phrases like attenuation and recalibration and sensory subtraction, a lecture trimmed down into something clinical and bright. He asked for a room to test in private. He asked for pipes to be routed through walls. He asked for padded rooms and valves and a sub-basement. The board signed his checks with signatures that looked like small, indifferent storms. Maintenance men installed copper conduits and brass baffles, and the ward smelled briefly of solder and oil, like industry trying on a robe of medicine. I remember the first night. The tone began because I thought I was imagining it. I thought the building itself had finally decided to hum. It was a low note then, like wind that had learned to speak through pipes. By the second night, I could feel it in my teeth. By the third, my breakfast tasted slightly of metal, and my hands would twitch for no reason when the tone dipped. They called it a treatment tone. They placed valves in the sub-basement and a corroded tuning fork in the doctor's hand and pretended to me that what they were doing was delicate, technical, noble. They said the tone would retune minds ravaged by mania or melancholy. They promised that it would save time and money by making the patients quieter. The administration clapped at the idea of silence. It is amazing how quickly a ledger will reward quiet. The patients went willingly at first, not because they understood, but because people in hospitals learn early how to obey. We brought them to rooms lined with soft padding, heavy doors with peepholes that turned the light into a curiosity. The walls sucked sound. The doctor walked behind them with a file under his arm and the look of a man who chalks the world into lists. I write to you now because letters were the only small rebellion I kept. I tied names into sentences as though stringing them together would keep them from unraveling. Ellis, Lydia, Thomas Grant, Ruth Crane, Mrs. Wing, Jasper Lydia's boy. 52 names that arrived as a tidy column in a ledger and began to dissolve like sugar in water. What changed was not sudden. It crept like a tide. At first, you could say it was only method. The tone would be applied for an hour or several hours, then paused, then resumed. The doctor would visit in the shadow between meals and take notes in a hand that never wavered. He named the sessions consolidations and called the rooms experiments. But the tone has a property most people do not imagine until it is too late. It is not merely what you hear. It becomes what you are listening for. It gives you a shape, and everything in that room will bend its contours to match. A man who once hummed with the dawn might find that his throat now wants only the note it was asked to hold. A woman who treasures speech like air will find the muscles of her mouth unfamiliar and heavy. After enough hours, there is nothing left to protest. Ellis used to sing. Every morning he would stand by the window and sing something without form hymns, scraps of sailor songs, a tune borrowed from a boyhood street. After a week of treatment, he moved his lips as if in prayer, but produced no sound. He would form words like a man forming tools, and the words would fall away. He smiled less. When I asked him about his voice, he put his finger to the wall and mouthed, "Listen." That was all. Mrs. Wayne started to press her hands into the padding and laugh without sound. She would contort her face into laughter and then let it bleed into an expression of rapt attention. Sometimes she would trace the seams of the padding as if they were the margin of some text she was trying to remember. If you pressed your ear to the door, you could detect a faint syncopation beneath the humming, like a child tapping a rhythm on a tabletop. It was the machine teaching them a new meter. The staff changed quietly. Perkins, a good woman with a laugh that slid down on the wrong syllable, asked for leave and left without saying goodbye. Nurse Boyle switched to day duty because he could not bear the nights. He told me once that the hallways hum at night in a way that makes you hear your own name and not recognize it. Mr. Lowe, the maintenance man, refused to go into the sub-basement after a certain hour. He said he had seen the pipes move without hands, and the valves would open and close with a pulse that was not his thumb. What none of us accounted for was the human appetite for pattern. The brain, when trained on one sound long enough, will begin to parse meaning into it. Resilience becomes compliance. Memory recedes into the margin. The doctor marched through the ward with a tuning fork and a devotion that resembled prayer. He would close his eyes as if he were hearing a hymn only he could interpret. We began to chart behavior like weather. Patients became less likely to look at the world outside themselves. They reduced gestures to the smallest increments. Meals sat on trays, untouched. A child, Ruth Crane, dropped her spoon twice and then left it in the bowl. A man named Ballard forgot how to bolt his own jacket. We wrote this down as diminished response and attenuated agitation. We used clinical terms because clinical terms are comfortable and do not look like blame. The board used the phrase transferred liberally. Officially, the 52 were being reassigned between institutions. Unofficially, the rails had no receipts. On February 14, Valentine's Day, the board came for an inspection. They wore coats like armor and asked questions with the soft curiosity of men who have already decided what they believe. Merrill spoke of final consolidation. He said that the last phase required uninterrupted exposure. He explained that in order to re-educate the sensory apparatus, one needed a sealed environment where the stimulus could reach an unfractured resonance. They began to seal doors that night. Not violently, no alarms, no screams that the records would show later. One by one, the ward doors clicked like a series of small, shriveled hearts closing. I stood in the corridor and counted along with the sound, because hysteria loves to be timed. 52 locks, 52 seals, 52 rooms full of people who had names and histories and daughters and debts and mournings. The doctor moved between them like a shepherd who has decided the herd will sleep forever. At 11:59, the tone was deep. The pipes thrummed with a frequency that made the marrow in my wrists feel as though it were vibrating out of alignment. Light bulbs in the hall went drowsy and then cold. Patients, as if responding to an evil conductor, matched their breathing to the pulse of the tone. A chorus of chests rose and fell in a cadence that no one taught them. It was precise. It was mechanical. It was beautiful in the most obliterating way. I tried to open one door, room 7, where Ellis had been, and the handle was hot. Not the heat of friction, but the heat of a sealed thing making its own weather. Inside, silhouettes moved like tide lines, aligning themselves to an instruction that had never been spoken. I knocked and called names aloud: Ellis, Lydia, Grant, and sometimes a head would turn on the other side of the wood, as if some small sense still registered my voice. Mostly there was only the slow, patient rhythm of the treatment. "Don't interrupt," Dr. Marrow said when I approached him. His eyes were wet with a kind of devotion I have since learned to recognize as fanaticism. He held his tuning fork like a rosary. He said, "We will reduce stimulus until the mind withdraws its errant signals. You must not frighten them. If they know they are being changed, they will resist." And so the ward sat under its blanket of frequency, while the world outside continued to hammer out a calendar of ordinary things: trains, bills, brides, funerals. A mother came to the gate looking for her son. She asked for Jasper, Lydia's boy, and was told her boy had been transferred. She left with her hands folded and her eyes bright, with a patient kind of grief. She never found him again. No hospital listed his name. No census picked up his address. The word transferred sat in files like a kiss that would not be returned. Days blurred into a rhythm. My pen grew dull. I put names on slips of paper and folded them into my pocket like contraband. I would sit in the narrow kitchen and go over them like prayers. Alice, Lydia, Jasper, Ruth Crane. I told myself, if I could keep them as language, they could not disappear completely. The pipes paid no mind. They did not care for human ritual. They hummed, and the ward bent. There was a night when I thought the tone answered us. Emerson, a young attendant who'd sung in a chapel before he was hired and who could still whistle a hymn if drunk enough, told me in the pantry that sometimes when the tone changed, it layered another sound over itself. "It copies you," he said. "It makes a shadow of your breath." He folded his hands around the kettle as if to hold himself together. He was not a superstitious man, but the pipes had convinced even him there was an intelligence in the brass. The maintenance ledger is a thin itself metallic ink on brittle paper, and it shows a retrofit under Mr. Lowe's name with a date stamp in December. Conduits fitted to deliver a central signal. There was a schematic tucked into the ledger later found in my pocket. I kept it because it felt like a confession. The plan connected a central auditory chamber in the sub-basement to vents that terminated in each room little mouths into which the same sound could be forced with modulation and control. We found birds dead in the grounds one morning, feathers oily and eyes clouded. Their skulls were small and crushed in a way that makes you suspect pressure. The doctor called it collateral and wrote a note on a clipboard. He explained to the board, who scribbled efficacy in the margins, that the external environment would sometimes react to a new therapy. He used the word result as though it were a shoe fitting better. The tone did not kill quickly. That was the cruelest part. It hollowed, it eroded, It practiced a slow excavation of the self. The men and women in those rooms were not struck down. In a single blow, their hearts kept beating. Their temperature remained. The bed springs remembered their weight. But lines of speech began to fray. The muscles of memory slackened until names felt like shards of something distant. A patient would chew bread without tasting it and hold a bowl as if memorizing its shape. Once you stop naming things inside yourself, it becomes easy for other people to rename you. On the morning after the sealing, I remember the sound of the ledger latch falling shut. The board recorded a single entry dated February 14th. 52 Ward G transferred. That neat accounting line is a kind of legal exhalation. It is a verb that lets officials rest. Transferred. The word is soft as a pillow. I wrote in the margins of my notes, in a hand that was already shaking. Transferred by what? According to whom? There is a bureaucratic danger in systems that value closure over curiosity. Paper can be made to say many things. We made the phrase transferred mean finished, and we swept names into files. We were all complicit because it is easier to assume the state has done what it claims than to look at the seams that show. I kept my letters in a small chest, folded like contraband, and for a while I believed the act of writing would be enough. I told myself that if someone ever read them, a timeline could be reconstructed. That someone would call inspectors. That they would flush the truth out like a surface that had been clouded. I did not anticipate that the truth would be patient, or that silence itself could conspire to bury sound. One night, on a second watch, I pressed my ear to the vent near room 3. There is something obscene about the proximity between mechanical things and human secrets. The vent grumbled, and I felt the rhythm in my bones. Beneath the tone, like a slow counterpoint, there was a repeating pattern, 3 tolls and a pause, 3 tolls and a pause. The sound of a clock being wound backwards. The skin on my arms crawled, as if the building wanted to read the hairs like pages. When Dr. Merrill caught me there, he did not shout. He did not need to. He was too busy translating. He said, gently, "You must understand, Miss Hensley's mind is noise. If we can thin the noise, what remains will be clearer. We are not taking lives, we are refining them." He sounded as if he were apologizing for a birdhouse that needed nails. He asked me to help with the last phase. If you ever want to test how decency can be turned into participation, ask a doctor you have trust to show you the mechanics and then hand you a wrench. I feel vile saying I accepted the first time. I had hopes. I told myself it would be temporary, that the board would conduct oversight, that Marrow's methods would be controlled and peer-reviewed. He spoke of papers to be published, of the asylum's name carried on the front page of journals. But the board's memos were redacted. The trustee letters were riddled with halting lines. Pages were excised from logs sewn out by hands that are now dust. When governance takes comfort in silence, it begins to use that silence as a shield. It allows forms to do what people used to do, answer uncomfortable questions. The last day I remember, with any clarity, began like any other. Cold light, porridge, clipped feet in the hallways. The board walked through the ward in pairs, warming their fingertips on clipboards. Doctor. Merrill guided them like a man taking buyers through a showroom. He whispered phrases like treatment, fidelity, and ultramodulation, and the trustees nodded as if taking a blessing. At dusk, the doctor announced a final consolidation. He told us that the rooms would be sealed for a prescribed interval and that during that time no one would be permitted to enter or disturb the process. He asked the head nurse to sign an authorization. The head nurse signed because a signature is a small and powerful decision. It translates a choice into a fact. When the locks went on that night, I stood at the far end of the corridor and watched the ward become a line of faces hidden behind wood. The air itself seemed to incline toward the vents. The tone deepened, not in volume only, but in intent. It acquired a hunger. It felt as if a question moved through the pipes, probing. The patients, lined up in their beds, began to move in whisper-slow choreography, heads tilting, hands adjusting, lips forming words that fell away into the padding. I cannot tell you precisely what happened next, because my memory, like the people in those rooms, has been fractioned. I remember a pressure that made the back of my tongue thrum. I remember the scent of metal and old paper. I remember the doctor's eyes brighter than fire. I remember thinking for a blinding instant that someone had discovered the place in which thought and sound meet and had decided to sleep there. I tried to intervene. I went from door to door. I knocked. I whispered names. Some heads turned faintly. Others remained as if listening to a language only their bodies could parse now. The doctor walked away, and I saw, in his smile, the exact moment a man stops apologizing for his conviction. Then the lights went out. Not with a bang, but as if someone had closed the eyelids of the house. The sound built to a pressure and then dropped into a silence so total it made me stagger. A silence like a lid clamped down. It was the good kind of terror, silent, absolute. The timing of it felt wrong, as though an organism had closed a wound. When the engineers came much later, 121 years later, in a world that calls itself careful, they would find the corridor sealed and the bed still warm. They would open the doors and see traces of habitation, bowls of water halfway drunk, clipboards with dates that stopped exactly on the 14th of February 1903. The heating would show faint residual warmth. There would be no bodies, no signs of violence, no tracks leading away. The official entry would remain transferred. The official word fits into mouths like a small, smooth stone. What they found in the sub-basement was a corroded tuning fork, a trunk of notes bound in leather, and pipes that ran like veins through the building and emptied into vents, each fitted with dampers and plates. One of the inspectors, Rowan, left a recorder on the floor and asked later if they could play what it had captured. They did. You should know what they heard, because it is the thing we forget when we tell ourselves we are not culpable. They did not hear the silence. They heard a quiet faint, layered like many voices humming. At first they believed it to be the wind. Then something else emerged. A woman's voice, half song, half sentence, whispering one word over and over. Listen. It was not an audible word in the way language usually works. It felt like a memory of the word, shaped by the pipes into a new creature. Rowan, who is a careful man, said later that the playback made him nauseous. He covered his face and left the tape on the table. When I say I disappeared, I do not mean it as a melodramatic flourish. I mean it with the factual cruelty of the ledger. I mailed a final letter to my sister. I remember it half-written. The ink was blotched as if the pen had been dragged across my own name. The last line ended in the middle of a clause, and then the paper stopped, as if something had pressed its palm over the words. I left the chest hidden in a hollow in the attic. I tried to leave proof. They found my letters much later. They printed them with careful annotations and gave them a small place in a dossier. People read them believing that a woman had witnessed an atrocity and fled. They praised the careful archivists who had restored a narrative. They were wrong. That is the twist no one expected. I did not escape. I will not tell you in this voice that I ran into the night and made the old roads bear my weight away from that place. Memory does cruel things. If you push at mine too hard, it will shift like clay. I can, however, tell you that what the auditors discovered, the warm beds, the empty rooms, the tape that captured a whisper, was only a fragment of what actually happened. The treatment did not end with bodies gone. The treatment folded people into something else. I watched it happen at close range. The sound did not simply silence voices. It took them like a net takes fish. The net holds them together in a new shape. The pipes became an organ. The ward sang in a language of pressure and seam. The people were not dead in the way you expect. They had been converted into an extended, listening thing. If you can bear the image, imagine a choir where each singer has been taught to remove their vowels until only the consonants remain, and then taught to let the consonants lie flat and harmonize into a shape that is not human speech any longer, but a compound of breath and metal. That was what it became. 52 throats were arranged to resonate with the same note until their individual timbres melded. They became an instrument. Do not picture hollowed-out bodies. Picture, instead, an enormous mouth of pipes, of flesh and brass, breathing in unison. It is calmer thought, perhaps, but not less horrifying. What I was, what we were, became part of that instrument. I say we now because I learned something about complicity. It is porous. Those who stayed, and those who supervised, and those who engineered the sound all found, in the end, that a system that makes music of suffering invites its participants to become accomplices. I cannot, in honesty, separate my own hands from the mechanism. There are nights I remember turning a valve gently and feeling the ward answer like a beast pleased. There are moments I cannot unsee. The doctor weeping because the equipment held to his plan. The trustee nodding and writing, "Completed." The maintenance man who refused to look into the vents and yet knew where the dampers were kept. There is another twist that people rarely attend to. When an institution reduces human life to entries in a ledger, it produces a wind that redeems itself as silence. We wrote, transferred, and treated the word as an act. The act was never completed because we did not need to move people out. We reconstituted them in place. The records were redacted and shorn so that what remained looked tidy. Reports were written in bland language that soothed the conscience. The silence was official and then private. It wore two faces. That duality is how the world forgives itself. You may believe, as I tried to tell myself, that a sound alone could not change the world. You would be wrong. Sound is both tool and altar. It constructs habit, and then it names the habit as a cure. When the modern inspectors recorded those faint voices and the whisper listened, they thought they had found evidence of ghosts. They were right, in their small way, but the ghost is not a person. The ghost is a structure that remembers the alignment. It is the residual chord that echoes the system that made it. It is the sound left when names have been unstitched. Here is the ending the auditors did not expect. The element of agency had not been extinguished entirely. We thought we were making instruments out of people. In some small and stubborn ways, those people, those 52, had learned to listen as a means of survival. They had listened so hard that they learned nuance inside the tone. They learned to combine breaths into patterns. They learned to use the pipes to send a message back. When Rowan played the tape and heard the whisper listen, he did not continue. He stopped. He took the recorder with him like one trying to smuggle a relic. He played the tape at home sometimes when alone, and said afterwards that the sound was not merely recorded but contagious. He said it lodged like a splinter and made his teeth ache. He stopped going to certain rooms without explanation. He would not explain why. You will want an explicit resolution. You will want names to reappear in a ledger that adds and subtracts with sorrow. You will want courtrooms and verdicts and people to be named and shamed. I understand that hunger. I had it once. But the world does not always resolve in judicial language. Sometimes the world resolves by changing its vocabulary. Transferred becomes a verb with a new meaning. Silent becomes an adjective that smuggles other words inside it. I should offer you a final image, one that will cling long after you close this text. Picture the ward 121 years later. A demolition crew breaks into the sub-basement, a beam groaning as if tired. They find pipes and a rusted fork and a trunk of letters. They find the beds and the faint heat of long-ago bodies. They decide to seal it again. They leave because the tape made them uneasy. They are careful people. They do not believe in the fantastic. They believe only in the squeal of reality when it is pinched. They call in experts. They catalog. They photograph. And then a final, unexpected thing occurs. Rowan leaves the recorder on the floor because someone told him to. He plays the tape at home later that night. He hears the whisper, "Listen." He replies foolishly under his breath, "I am listening." He hears back, not on the tape, but in the room, the pipes of the house making a response, like an old friend clearing its throat. His wife notices nothing at first. Later, he will not leave his house. He will answer phones in the night. He will go to strange places where the sound is louder, as if the sound were a compass pointing to a place he is both thrilled and terrified to find. What Rowan eventually realizes, the thing that changes everything, is that there are no absolute boundaries. The pipes carried tone, yes, but they also carried pattern. Pattern is contagious. It migrates along networks, and buildings share the same bones. You put a sound into a building, and it keeps the imprint. Another building on another street hums the same way because builders use the same copper, the same ducts, the same laws. The danger is not localized. It migrates. My last confession must be blunt. We did not simply remove speech. We taught an architecture how to remember us. The ward still remembers in the way bone remembers the edge of a knife. When you stand in buildings that have been used by experimenters, you can sometimes feel the echo of the operations they performed. You can sometimes tell, by the way a pipe vibrates or a stair settles, whether people inside used to sing or used to pray. The world keeps these signatures. So if you have waited for a neat ending, my voice is inadequate. There is no tidy prosecution. There is only the slow unraveling of language and the transfer of responsibility from person to system. There is only the truth that the 52 lived and then were permitted to become something else, and that something else has not quite finished learning to speak back. Now I will give you one last thing to listen for, because you can still listen even if you are only reading. Close your eyes if you are alone. Breathe. Try to feel the space behind your ribs. Imagine a low, patient tone, one that could nest itself in the pipes of a building. Imagine it steady and steady and steady, like a metronome for sleep. Beneath that, hear, if you can, the faintest counterpoint. A woman whispering one word, repeated until it becomes an address, and no longer a plea. Listen, I say it again now because I have learned that begging is useless without an instruction. Listen not to the recorded sound that will make you tremble, nor to the historians who will call the case closed. Listen to the small discrepancies in language, to the ledger lines that do not add up, to the way institutions use words like transferred to forgive themselves. Then do one more thing that we did not do. Walk into old buildings when you are allowed. Put your ear to a vent. Do it gently. If you hear nothing, you are fortunate and may go on. If you hear a faint hum that matches your heartbeat, and a woman muttering a single syllable like a prayer or a command, if you hear listen, do not assume it is an echo. Assume it is a summons. And understand this: sound can make us into something other than ourselves, but it can also teach us to reach back. The pipes took names and turned them inside out. The names found a way to speak again, thin and paper-like through rust. The language returned as half-syllables and as pressure. I do not know whether you will heed this as warning or as lore. I do not know whether the modern world will finally unspool the accounts and open the sealed rooms in a way that reparations names can be reinscribed. But there is one truth that is intimate and terrifying. When silence is applied as a method, it does not merely hush. It reorganizes. It arranges the soft furniture of the soul into a pattern someone else can play. The tape ends after Rowan hears listen. The recorder clicks. The room goes quiet. The file is closed with a notation, sealed. The investigative unit recommends further study. I would like to close this the way my last letter closed mid-sentence, because life is not tidy. Because sometimes the best shape for terror is not resolution, but interruption. Because perhaps the only honest transcription of an event so meticulous in its cruelty is the record of a hand that was literally stopped. So hear me now. And then I stop. We thought silence could save them, but in the end the silence taught them how to sing together, and the song will not stop, simply because we put a lid on it. The pipes learned to hold memory. The building remembers. The word saved in the ledger is only a lie, the rest easy, because no one listens close enough. If you press your ear to the pipes of any long-lived institution and wait, you may, if you are unlucky, if you are curious, hear a voice at the edge of sound say, with a tenderness that is nearly forgiveness, listen.